All right, everyone. Welcome to week 6 of our webinar, Reporting the Results, the write-up and results, the elusive skill. Okay, so after you're done with all the analysis, this is where it takes you. Right? So William O'Bannon of StatsWhisperer bringing you your webinar installment for today. Now, first of all, as always, we like to keep in mind where we are in our 6-step process of data analysis. And we are at the end, right? Step number 6, the old write-up and report, right? So for data analysis, right, that would be probably like the eHarmony commercial where the people say, we met on eHarmony and it was a great success. For us data analysts, it is a bit more of a process, right? I mean, you could try that, right? But I'm not sure in science if you'll get very far, just sitting there and saying what a success it was, right? So you need to know how to write out the results so it's acceptable to the scientific community. Right, so we are going to describe the results in both tables and text. All right, so the first thing I should say is that, of course, the write-up, hopefully you've seen the written materials we submitted for this week. You'll notice the write-up has a lot of words and it has a lot of numbers. Too many words and numbers to fit comfortably on a slide without crowding the slide, right? So I recommend that while you look at these slides, you also have the written materials to refer to, because this webinar today is like a magnifying glass, right? We're just holding the magnifying glass to magnify little words and phrases and terms on that big old write-up. Okay, so great to have the whole write-up in front of you, and we will go through and accentuate some of the most important points. So let's accentuate. So the write-up, right? So it's not just the results section, right? When we do a statistical analysis, there are parts we put in the methods section too. So we will review part of the methods section, the part that has to do with statistics. We won't talk about research design and things and procedures. We're just going to talk about what's in the methods that's pertinent to our statistical analysis. And then the results section, we'll be going through all of that because all of the results section tends to be expressed in the form of statistics. All right, the methods section. So you might ask, just what part of the methods section is statistically oriented? Right, so, well, first, the research questions, because that lists the constructs that we are going to measure, say it with me, statistically, right? Then the sample, right, because we want to provide a description of the sample, and that's often expressed in tables and text statistically. Pardon me, we have our statistical power calculations, right? So that's usually in the methods too, telling us if we have enough people to pick up the effect we're looking for in the statistical analysis. The instrumentation, now that's statistically oriented because in this section we often report things like the Cronbach's alpha for the current sample, right? Some measure of psychometric validation, meaning some measure which tells us the instrument is sound, that's expressed statistically. And then our data analysis plan, obviously, that's our plan for implementing our statistical analysis. At the univariate, bivariate, and multivariate level, speaking of which, right, we have our results section. that we'll be going through. And we will be going through the descriptive analysis in tables and text, otherwise known as the univariate level of analysis. We'll be going through, our bivariate analysis in tables and text, and our multivariate analysis in tables and text. Right? So you can see we're going to be going through a lot of letters and numbers, right? So we're going to boil it down to the essentials here, and please refer to it in the written materials. So our research questions. So suppose our research questions are, what factors are significantly associated with levels of happiness? What factor has the strongest impact, right? Research question 2, on levels of happiness. Good questions, right? Good questions in life too, right? So what makes us happy, and what one factor has the biggest impact on our happiness? So in the methods, right? The next part is the sample, right? So we present it in a paragraph, right? Text form. So the paragraph for all these usually starts off with table, table blank presents. Right? So this being our first table, we have table 1 presents. Right? Table's always capitalized. Table 1 presents the demographic characteristics of the 50 participants involved in the current study. Okay, so that's the way to start that paragraph. Then we simply go one by one, sentence by sentence, presenting the characteristics of that sample. For example, we have our categorical variable, data indicated half the sample, 50%, n equals 25, is comprised of females, and descriptive of a continuous variable. The average study participant is about 40 years old, right? And then we express those numbers in table form, right? So we have table 1, and this is APA format. You might do APA, MA, AMA, MLA, whatever's good, right? So this is APA format. So we have gender. Okay, so we have the title at the top, study participant demographic characteristics, right? We have, variable, and then the N and the percent. So the N is the number of people, right? If it's part of the sample, it's a lowercase n. If it's the whole sample, it's an uppercase n, right? So in this case, the N is talking about the sections here, right? So we have here gender, right? So female with the N, 25, so 25 females. Male with the N, 25 males, and it's 50% each, right? So it helps if this matches the text, right? Well, it should match the text perfectly, right? So age, the N is 50, so that's everybody, and it's 40 years, and the average age, and then we have our standard deviation and the min-max scores, right? And then we have education, right? So you have the number in each category, 19 high school, right? And what percentage is that of the whole? It's 38%, right? And then down the line, right? So pretty good. And then, of course, this is truncated. You're probably going to have more variables than this to present and describe. But once you can describe a few, then pretty much you can describe as many as you need. Now next, power analysis. So in the paragraph describing the power analysis, right? So all we really need is the paragraph. Right? most people don't really do anything but the paragraph, and that's fine. So it's nice to mention the methods or the software used, right? And so we did G-Power, which was the free online system, right? And we talked about right before how power has to be at least 80%, so power is set at 0.80. The probability has to be set at 0.05, right, usually, or even below sometimes. And then we have to specify our effect size, is small, medium, or large. And those, all put into G-Power, will tell us the number of study participants needed, right? So it's just fine to state each of those facts and say the resulting number of study participants needed was, blank. Now, one thing that's important to bear in mind, the G-Power is perhaps the most user-friendly type of power analysis software there is, right? It asks you for those criteria, and it gives you the number. Now, a lot of other power analysis software will ask for other values, such as, what's the mean or standard deviation or some kind of value like that to do a power analysis, right? And as you can imagine, it's just less convenient than G-Power, right? And it could be many other values. So sometimes you need to refer to other studies and say, well, the standard deviation in prior research for this variable has been this, and then you would plug that in there and then note the article or the source that gave you that value, right? So just bear in mind that different software for power analysis may ask for different things. The instrumentation. Pardon me. Now this is an important one. Sometimes, especially when we do our dissertations, you'll see a description of an instrument that may go on for 4 or 5 pages, which is fine because we're not limited usually in our dissertations with how much room we have to describe our instrument. However, when you're doing your peer-reviewed research articles, you may have only 3,000 words, so you don't have a lot of room to describe your instruments. So you need to boil them down to the essentials so you can have an economy of words, but also express the most important features of those instruments. So, for example, we have our demographic characteristics that we're measuring. And you'll see in our written piece, the first thing we say is that happiness was measured with the happiness, the demographics, right, of the happiness study participants was measured with the happiness study demographic questionnaire, which is fictional. But you have to say that the name of the instrument, and then you put the citation, and hopefully it's the citation that, of the article that introduced the instrument, to the field, right? And then you start describing what the instrument asks of study participants, as in participants are asked to provide demographic information, age, gender, education, many bills monthly, right? So that's kind of the simple one. So let's take a little more complex instrument, right? So let's say we're looking at the instrument measuring humor. Okay, so the first thing we say is humor is measured via the humor checklist, right? So again, you list the name of the instrument measuring the construct, and you put the citation, that describes the instrument, being created, how it was normed, which means how they identified, usually normed means they gave it to many participants to see if the instrument was valid and the psychometric qualities. And so the next thing is you report the number of items on the instrument, okay? And then you can report, who it's completed by, if it's completed by parents, children, right? You mentioned that here. But you report who completes it too. So this is a self-report inventory, which means they give it to the person, and the person completes it themselves. Or somebody may read it out loud, and the person gives the responses, particularly in the case with children. Right? But it's good to say who completes it. It could have been completed by the interviewer. The interviewer could watch the interviewee and create and answer a scale, right? How comfortable did the interviewee seem, right? And so who completes it? So it's a self-report inventory. And then it's always good to mention how the items are measured. Are the items measured yes, no, maybe, right? Or on a Likert scale. So these items are measured upon a Likert scale, from 1 being not at all and 5 being extremely. So these are 3 factors that you should mention, when they're available for any instrument that you're using. Now, how are the scores created? That should be reported on each instrument too. So here, the mean of all the valid responses, right, are used. So if you take the mean of the valid responses, since the Likert scale is 1 to 5, the potential range of scores will be 1 to 5, right? And you should always indicate what a higher score represents. So a higher score means more humor, right? And then after you describe those essentials, you can start describing the history of the instrument, right? And there's a widely used instrument. Maybe put some citations there of other studies that have used the instrument, right? Then you could put some comments about the psychometric qualities, right? Like, if it displayed good concurrent and criterion validity with similar instruments, right? Meaning there's this big other happiness measure that everyone uses, and it's the greatest measure in the world, right? So you want concurrent validity, like, so our happiness measure measures happiness that's concurrent with the other happiness measure, right? Like they match. And if the smaller one matches the big widely used one, that makes it look valid, right? And then finally, what's presented for almost every continuous measure, right? The Cronbach's alpha, which reflects reliability in the form of internal consistency, right? So that's the reliability analysis. So if there's no other analysis, that will be the only one, right? So that's important to report. So you have a list. What is it? Seven details of the instrument that should be mentioned. Now, right, now here's where we're talking big money here, right? Here's where you're getting your money's worth, because this is the data analysis plan. And this is nice to include in, in your peer-reviewed journal articles saying this is our plan. But even more so when you're writing a proposal, right? You have to say, this is how we're going to analyze our data once we collect it. And so the data analysis plan can be for a report you're writing in the write-up, but it can also be for a proposal that you're writing. And a lot of people come to me and they want help specifically writing the data analysis plan in their proposal. So we're going to cover it here so you'll have that skill. Okay, so the data analysis plan, it's nice to state the number of steps that will be involved in the data analysis plan. Okay? And for us, our first step is to look at the variables descriptively, the univariate level of analysis, the means and percentages. Second, to test the bivariate relationships between the independent and dependent variable. And third, look at the relationship between the independent variables with the dependent variable at the multivariate level, the joint effects of all those independent variables on the dependent variable. Now, the thing with the proposal is we would say we're going to examine, the test assumptions. Right? We're going to assess linearity and all those. But for our write-up, right, we should have already have done those tests, and then we're reporting that we did do those tests and what the results were. Right? So we would say we conducted the test of test assumptions, and they were met, as in there was a linear relationship between the dependent and independent variable. Right? There was an equivalence of variances. There was homoscedasticity, right? So we made checks of heteroscedasticity, which is what we don't want. So we say we made checks of heteroscedasticity, and there was none, and there was homoscedasticity. Right? So we made our checks of multicollinearity, and there were no problems. And we looked at our continuous variables and saw that there were normal distributions. We could also mention here, in terms of normal distributions, that we check for outliers. Right? Well, if there were outliers, the distribution wouldn't have been so normal. But it's always nice to still mention we checked for outliers, and that there are no outliers driving the findings. And then, this is the same with the proposal, you always need a missing data plan, right? So for us in our write-up, we have to report if there were any missing data, and if there were, how did we handle those missing data? So in our written materials, we said there were missing data in the form of 3 people skipping one item on one of the scales. Right? So what do? SPSS, if somebody has one missing score, it would eliminate them from the analysis. And maybe we don't want to do that, right? So what we said we would do is if somebody had at least 80% of the items of the scale completed, we would take the valid mean of the items they did complete, right? So for example, if somebody was missing one item on a scale that had 10 items, right, they have 9 valid responses, which is 90%, which is greater than 80%, so we'd include them. So we would take the valid mean of the 9 items, and that score, because it's a mean, would still be between 1 and 5, and we would include them in the scores with all the other people that had scores of, that filled out all 10 items, because their means would still be between 1 and 5 too. Important note, sometimes when you complete a scale, they'll sum the items, right? So if they did 9 items, right? So the range is between 1 and 5. So if they complete 10 items, right? What's that potential range? Well, if they answer 1 for 10 items, it's 10. And then if they answer 5, which is the maximum, for all 10, it's 50. So the range would be 10 to 50 if you sum the items, right? However, if they only answered 9 items, the potential range would only be between 9 and, right, 9 and, right, because it's that -1. So if they answered all 9 1, they would only get a 9. But if the other person answered all 9 1, they would get a 10, right? So the important thing to bear in mind is that if you sum them and they skip an item, there's a different potential range of scores, right? So it's not comparable, and that wouldn't be a good way to account for the missing data, right? So taking the mean instead of summing the items could be part of your, plan to deal with missing data. Okay. Little aside. Now, next we get into our analysis. Right? So first, we want to present the data descriptively. Right? So we would say like what the mean of humor was. Right? So of course we say the mean, the standard deviation, the min-max, which is the highest and lowest scores. Right? Then we would present it all in table form. Right? Pretty simple, right? So we have table 2 is the mean, the standard deviation, and the min-max values. Right? And then we see in the title there, right? We say that we have the variable, the means, the standard deviation, the min-max, and then the potential range. And you always want to report the potential range because that makes the mean more meaningful, right? So if the potential range is 1 to 5 and the mean is 3.68, right, we know the middle of the scale is 2.50, and the mean, the average score, is a little more than the middle of the scale, right? However, if the potential range was 1 to 10 and the mean was 3.68, then that mean would have been, below the middle of the scale, right? So if you report the mean and don't report the potential range of scores, you don't really know how to judge that mean. So it's really good to have it. Okay, now, the bivariate analysis itself. As I said, we always start off that paragraph with table so-and-so, as in table 3 presents the results of the bivariate analysis between the independent variable and the dependent variable, right? So you'll see that we describe first the t-test, right? So our t-test told us in Many Bills Monthly, right, that there was a lower mean score for people who had Many Bills Monthly relative to those who did not have Many Bills Monthly. So even in the text, right, you want to report those numbers, just like the descriptives, right? But you also want to report the inferential test at the end. So in the text, we put the means, the standard deviation. So when you refer to, those with Many Bills Monthly, you see the mean right there. Relative to those without Many Bills Monthly, you have the mean right there. Then at the end, you put the statistics for the inferential test, right? The test testing those associations, which here is the t-test, right? So we have the t, what it equals, and the level of probability. So no problem. A little more numbers and writing for the ANOVA, right? Because we had to do the post-hoc test, right? So, but we would state it much the same way, right? We would say the ANOVA indicated that happiness varied significantly by categories of education or levels of education, whichever you prefer. And then we report the results of the ANOVA, which is expressed in the F statistic, and then the degrees of freedom, which for ANOVA is a ratio that's given in the output, if you'll recall. So it's 2, column 47, and then equals the value of the ANOVA, 39.70, and the p-value. But after that, then we have to describe the Bonferroni post-hoc test. So yes, we say there's the ANOVA indicated a significant difference between means, and in the text, we have to say just what those significant differences are, which mean is significantly different from which other mean, right? So we say college was significantly greater than high school regarding levels of happiness, and graduate school was significantly higher than high school, and it was significantly higher than college. And so there we go. That's our paragraph. Then, of course, we need to present it in a table form. And again, this is APA format. So table 3, presenting mean levels of happiness by categories. We always want to put the N, how many people were in the analysis referred to. So you'll see we have in the heading, independent variable, N, the mean, standard deviation. Then you want to report the statistic for the test. And it's either a T or an F because we have both the t-test and an ANOVA presented, pardon me, and the p-value. So the first one, many bills monthly, right? So in the yes, the first line yes, we see there's 20 people, N of 20, and their mean was 2.74. Right? You have the standard deviation, the value of t, degrees of freedom, and probability, right? And on down the line. Now you'll notice for the highest level of education, in the write-up, it doesn't really fit on the slide, but we have the Bonferroni post hoc test, at the bottom reporting which categories were significantly different. The idea is that you can look at the table and get as much information from the table as the whole paragraph, as the whole text in the paragraph, right? So you can look at the table and see all the needed information. So that's why you might want to put at the bottom the results of the Bonferroni test, right? And there you go. Now the correlations, right? So you'll notice they're significantly more scant, right? So Table 4 presents the results of the bivariate analysis between the independent dependent variable. Very good. And specifically, the correlations indicated a significant positive association with humor and happiness. Right? Then we have the R, that's the statistic for the Pearson's R, and the probability. And then a negative association with aloofness. And we also have the R with the minus sign indicating a negative relationship and the probability. And then same with the tables, right? It's a little less busy than the other tables, right, where you just show the correlation. So Table 4, Pearson's zero-order correlations between the independent dependent variable and a 50. And the 1, 2, 3, corresponds to the variables up and down. So happiness is 1, humor is 2, aloofness is 3, and then you're seeing the intersection of each. So where it says 2, that's the intersection of happiness and humor. And where you say 3, that's the intersection of happiness and aloofness. And this, numbers at the top helps out when it's maybe 5, 6, 7 variables in the correlation because it gets a little crowded. Now finally, we have our multivariate tests. Right? This too first needs to be expressed in the form of a paragraph and then in tables. So again, the beginning of the paragraph should say table blank, in this case Table 5, presents the results of a linear regression analysis between the independent variables and the dependent variable. The first thing to mention is that if the overall model was statistically significant, right? And if you're reporting it, it probably was. So there's the F value, right, for the whole test, and the degrees of freedom, all reported on the printout, and the value of the F, the level of probability, right? It has to be below 0.05, and then the R squared, if you'll recall, is the variance explained in the dependent variable by all the independent variables. Right? So remember, it's almost 50%. So almost half the variance in the scores of happiness, right, what makes them go up and down, are explained by the variables in our regression model. And so first things to report. Then the next thing to report are the value of the independent variables. Right? So we would say many bills monthly was associated with lower levels of happiness. Then we report the beta at 0.45 and the standard error of 0.18. Then we report the standardized beta and level of probability. And the same with aloofness. Right? So these are all statistics that you just put right in that text. It makes it look very scientific. Okay. Then education was not significantly associated with happiness, but humor was. And then, we might want to, you don't see them say it often, right? It's not normally reported, but we could say that humor was the strongest predictor in our model because it had the highest standardized beta of 0.44. So that answers our research question. So if we look at the table, we see what factors are associated with happiness. Many bills monthly, right? And so we see the P at the end of each, and then humor, and then aloofness. What was most strongly related was humor because it has the highest standardized beta, right? The funny-looking B, right? The Latin B of 0.44, which is higher than any of the others. And you'll see in the table at the bottom, we report the overall significance and the statistical values for the overall model, as well as the R-squared. And then, of course, up top, Table 5, which presents linear regression analysis examining happiness with an N of 50. And then we report in the heading the variable. And the first B is the unstandardized beta, which, of course, refers to the change in the dependent variable relative to the change in the independent variable. We went over the standard error. Then the next B is the standardized beta, telling us the strength of the predictor in the model, and then the level of probability, telling us if it's a significant relationship. Right? So there we go. And then we have it. We take the numbers off the output, and we enter them right in. And so in education, of course, it doesn't say reference group on the printout, because that group was the one left out. So in the model, text table write-up, it's nice to put in what the reference group is, even though it wasn't significant here. And there we have it. We have the tables and text and write-up in the methods and results for our study. And we went through the linear regression model here, which is the most involved, right, because we have logistic and multinomial. However, they are much less involved. They have not as many test assumptions, for example, as linear regression. So we went over the linear regression because if you can go through that, the other two are actually more manageable. Okay, well, that's great. All right, everybody, I will speak to you at the next webinar. Okay, bye-bye.